everybody. Thanks for taking the time out very early this Wednesday morning. I hope for many of you it's a sunny morning. It certainly is here in Essex, where I'm talking to you from. So my name is Chris Hossack. I'm one of the Associate Directors at Creators Communications, and we wanted to put on a webinar this morning to talk about the rollout of electric vehicle charging points across the UK. And we've called the subject of this webinar Hitting Accelerate, because I think there's a general feeling that as a country and all the agencies involved in the EV charging infrastructure, there is a real need to hit accelerate on this. And the reason I say that is that a recent policy exchange report has indicated that if you look at what we've got to achieve by 2030, which is when combustion engine vehicles cease to be sold, we really need to ramp up as a country the rollout and delivery of the EV charging infrastructure. In fact, a five-fold increase in the rate at which we're delivering it at the moment. And I've got numbers in front of me that I won't bore you with, but it really does say that we've got to really hit the gas, if I can say that. But actually, it's hit the button, I think, with an electric vehicle and really accelerate the rollout. So as I say, my name's Chris Hossack. We've got a fantastic panel with us this morning. I'm just going to go briefly and turn to each one and just introduce them, and they'll just say a few words about themselves. So first of all, Baroness Brown, Dame Julia King, can I turn to you just for a few words of introduction?
So good morning, everyone. I suppose when I did the King review, looking at how to decarbonise road transport, we started that back in 2006, so 15 years ago. So I didn't think it was going to take this long, but I'm really glad to hear that we're talking about accelerating things, and particularly charging infrastructure, because that's, of course, what so many people say is making them nervous about thinking about the switch to an electric vehicle.
Fantastic. 15 years ago, when we're still talking about it needing to accelerate, that's quite an insight, really. It's quite a thought, isn't it, really? So, Councillor David Renard, if I can introduce you.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everybody. I'm the leader of Swindon Borough Council, and I'm also the chairman of the Local Government Association Board covering economy, environment, housing and transport. And as we know, in terms of climate change, housing and transport are the two big issues that we need to address if we're to become net carbon zero. And in Swindon, we're busily trying to get more charging points installed, and fully appreciate the challenges that there are in terms of getting EV uptake and getting the infrastructure in place. So really looking forward to the discussion today.
Thank you, David. Ian Johnston, if I can turn to yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Morning, everyone. I'm Ian Johnston, the CEO of Osprey Charging. We're one of the UK's largest public charging networks. We work with a number of local authorities, borough councils, and indeed Cardiff City Council as well, where we fully fund the deployment of rapid and slow charging across the local authority area, and then pay a rent to the local authority as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. And last but by no means least, Nick, if I can turn to you.
Thanks, Chris. Morning, everyone. I'm Nick Harvey. I'm a Senior Programme Manager at Energy Saving Trust. For those of you who don't know the Energy Saving Trust, we are an independent organisation that's promoting energy efficiency across home energy and transport to address the climate emergency. In terms of this conversation, what's most prudent is we deliver a package of independent and fully funded support that's funded through National Government, DfT, OZEV, that looks to help local authorities promote and drive transport decarbonisation.
Thank you, Nick. So that's great. So as you can see, a really great panel, quite a broad panel with lots of insight from different angles into this subject. And what I will say just at the outset before we get into it, it is a huge subject. We've only got an hour. There are sort of 4 sections I want to cover off, so I'm going to be quite pushy on the pace so we cover as much insight from our panelists as possible. And it may well be that, we need to revisit this because I think some of these subjects that we'll touch on this morning are probably an hour at least session in themselves. So I think, forgive us for that, but I think it's better to start the conversation and have that conversation, get this on the agenda, get people chatting and talking about it than not at all. So hopefully you'll all find it useful. So without further ado, I want to kick off, as I say, because we're going to be tight on time this morning and we're 5 minutes in already. So I think the starting point is this. We know the motor industry has announced that by 2030 you will not be able to buy a combustion engine vehicle. There'll still be diesel and petrol engine vehicles on the road, but you won't be able to buy one as new. And the motor industry seems to me to be really geared up to meet this objective of going completely EV in terms of the vehicles they retail. So how can we ensure, and I say we, that's everybody on this call, particularly local authorities who have a big role to play in it, how can we ensure the infrastructure keeps pace? And Baroness King, if I can come to you first, because to be fair, you started the subject 15 years ago, so it'd be good, I think, to kick off with you on this point. Thank you.
One of the things I would say, first of all, local authorities have an absolutely critical role to play in this. It's really key. My big shout would be that national government needs to make sure that local government has the funds it needs to get on with this. And I think they're being far too parsimonious at the moment. But I think we've really got to ensure that every area has an energy plan, because this is going to require quite a significant change in energy, and it really does. We really do need to have the local network providers and the local council or the combined authority working hand in hand on a common strategy, because otherwise we're going to have all of these problems that we've heard of in London, for example, when the parcel delivery people have been told they're going to have to pay enormous amounts of money to connect into the local network because they are suddenly providing a really big additional load on the network. So we've got to iron out all those problems to make this run smoothly and have the electricity system and the providers of that working hand in glove with the councils and with the people providing the charging infrastructure.
Thank you. David, Baroness Brown said there that the local authorities have a critical role to play in this. So just from your perspective as the LGA chair that oversees this portfolio, some comments from you perhaps on that point.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Baroness Brown's just said. Local authorities are key to this, and it does need a nationwide strategy. I mean, we've got a situation where we've got lots of different types of plug-in equipment, lots of different types of suppliers with different apps, and a degree of standardization would certainly be helpful, because local authorities don't want to install equipment that they find 5 years down the road has been taken over by a larger provider or whatever it is. So but we do need to get the funding sorted, absolutely. I think that's an important point. My own authority recently have bid for some money to install about 20 charging points on some streets in an older part of town, and that every time you have to bid for this money, it's a lot of time and effort, and also to deliver just 20 charging points doesn't really seem to be doing any more than scratching the surface of the problem that we've got here.
Thank you, David. Nick, the Energy Saving Trust has actually got some really good insight and real useful information on your website about the bidding. I think there's 2 points, and I want to come to yourself and Ian in turn. Ian's at the sort of coalface, if you like, of actually bolting this stuff into the ground, and you're at the coalface when it comes to helping advise and assist local authorities in getting the funding. So can I talk to you, Nick, just share your comments on that side of the challenge, if you like, ahead?
Absolutely, Chris. So obviously at the Energy Saving Trust, we do have a local government support programme, which is predominantly focused at supporting local authorities in the delivery of low carbon transport, which is in the essence of is in the first instance is getting that kind of charging infrastructure in place. We obviously talk with local authorities across the country in England, and so we understand the issues that local authorities face on a local level. I mean, we have support structures in place to be able to kind of guide local authorities into being able to create correct bids for the funding that is available, so that we create some efficiencies there, because we do understand that sometimes local authorities don't have the skill sets in-house to be able to identify appropriate infrastructure or even appropriate locations. So we do understand that there is probably a skills gap within local authorities and a resource gap. So that's where we try and fill in. But absolutely agree with all the comments here that we are only one organisation funded to a certain level to support that kind of rollout. So for mass adoption at pace, that there probably will need to be more support than just what's currently available.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll come to you in a moment, Ian, as well. But, you know, I think the opening question is, are we keeping pace? And I'm getting the vibe from the panel here that there's not, and there is more to be done. So we do have a real challenge ahead of us, I think, over the next 9 years and beyond, actually. Ian, you're, as I say, you're at the coalface when it comes to actually delivering the hard infrastructure, and you're working with local councils. You alluded to at the beginning of the call. Talk us through some of the pitfalls and challenges around that, and some of the key lessons that local authorities could learn as they sort of expand or embark on this EV project.
Yeah, I think, look, from my perspective, there is a mass rollout of charging infrastructure today across the UK. There's thousands and thousands of chargers going in. And I think the difference of today versus 2 years ago is that there's now a kind of multi-million-pound industry, a professional industry that is funding, deploying and managing this infrastructure. And that certainly wasn't the case 2 years ago, which meant it was difficult for councils to make that decision of choosing a partner that might then cause them more issues down the line. I think the rollout is not... we're not seeing the same level of rollout with local authorities. And I think that's driven mainly by the other priorities, of course, that every local authority has at the moment, but also the resourcing issue. I don't think it's an issue so much of cash. I think it's around the human resource to manage these very big, complicated procurement processes. But the great news for local authorities is that there is a way to achieve a rollout of infrastructure without needing to spend any money, and where the local authority can be the landlord and can allow this private market to have a competitive market within it, and for the local authority to benefit from the revenues of that and having the infrastructure provided, and also the residents benefit as well. So in the last 9 months during the lockdown, this market has exploded into a very professional, competitive industry, where when the resource allows it with the local authorities, a competitive process can see a huge rollout of millions of pounds of money going into each borough in terms of charging infrastructure. So I think it's happening across the UK. The bit we need to connect is that some of the best sites, or some of the most relevant locations that need this infrastructure, are the local authority car parks, the local authority sites. So we need to get the infrastructure into those sites, and that needs the processes to be kicked off to bring that private investment in.
It also goes back, when looking at sites, to what Baroness Brown said at the beginning about having this energy plan. So it does overlay with the people like UKPN, etc., and their nodal points for delivering the level of power that's needed to power these charging points. And I think what I'm taking from that is it's great to hear, Ian, that there is a lot of work going on, and it has accelerated, and that as an industry, in charging provider industry, that level of support is there, not just to deliver the stuff, but advise on it as well. But I think, the thing I take from, if you look on something like the ZapMap online, you see a lot of charging points that are in or going in, but a lot of them seem to be driven by people like, the forecourts, the private companies, hotels, supermarkets. And I just picked up on a comment there that you were saying about council-owned assets, and we'll talk about this a bit later on, around utilising our car parks, our multi-stories. On street we'll get into talking about as well, because that's another aspect of the whole rollout of the charging infrastructure. Okay, so I think that was a useful thing to kick off. There were some positives there. There were some green shoots of positivity, but also I'm taking away from it that we've got a massive challenge ahead of us as a country to keep pace. Because again, I just compare what local authorities are doing with the motor industry, and the motor industry seems totally up for it. They're ready to go. They know they're going to be full EV on their fleet by 2030. And it's just about that pacing with that, isn't it? I think, really. Okay, so we're 15 minutes in already, just about. So, and I want to develop a couple of things that came up there. And the sort of next theme that I want to throw out to you all as a panel is the government providing the correct level of support? So obviously, government underpins a lot of what local authorities, local government deliver. So David, just in that broad question to you, again, with your LGA hat on and your council leader hat on, what's your sort of take on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the points that Nick and Ian were making earlier on, really, about the market. I mean, the big question here for me is the market going to provide this, or do local authorities need to step into the space and, if there's some market failure, start to make things happen? And Nick made the point that local authorities don't necessarily have the right staff with the right skills to deliver on this. So I think if the market is going to step in, then local authorities have a really important role in terms of facilitating. So to some extent, that will determine how much government support is required to put the infrastructure in. Totally agree that car parks, local authority owned car parks, is one of the key areas that we need to make sure that infrastructure is in place. So we need to really map out where is the market going to provide, and where do the local authorities need to step in and fill in the gaps. And I suspect the answer is that, as you said, with supermarkets and other commercial premises, they're already stepping into the space. But what local authorities can do is change planning approvals. So, for example, we've got a large development to the south of the borough where we've entered into an agreement with Connected Curb, and they're putting all the infrastructure in now, along with the broadband and the other utilities, to make sure that anybody who moves in into the future, that the estate is future-proofed and ready for development. The challenge is the existing infrastructure, and particularly residential, terraced high streets, those sorts of places, and finding the resources to put it in there, because I'm not convinced that the market at the moment is going to be able to step into those sorts of places.
Thanks, David. Baroness Brown, you've been very close to central government on this issue, as you've said, for a number of years. So any comments from you around whether you feel the government centrally is providing the correct level of support? And then maybe, Nick, I'll come to you about your take on what you feel local government is doing in terms of level of support required. Baroness Brown.
I don't know. I can't comment really intelligently on whether the levels are right, although I suspect they're not high enough. But what I would comment, I'm chairing the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Independent Climate Commission, and one of the things we've heard in spades from our local authority colleagues is that all of these schemes for local green initiatives seem to have ridiculously short deadlines and enormous amounts of bureaucracy, and that people are really struggling. So Nick's comment about being able to help from the Energy Savings Trust is one I shall certainly be feeding back and making sure that all our councils locally are properly aware of that. But government needs to make these things long term and simple, because this needs to happen. We shouldn't be making busy people in our local authorities jump through hoops. It really isn't right. And I would also say, sort of part of government, the regulatory system, we need to make sure Ofgem is getting on with allowing the network companies to do investment ahead of need, so that actually the networks are ready for this, not that as soon as somebody makes a proposal, it's oh my goodness, how are we going to get power to that problem?
Thank you. Nick, just before I come to you, the other thing I just want to pick up on there, Baroness Brown, is you mentioned being part of the Cambridge-Peterborough Combined Authority in the way you're chairing the panel there. So there's a much more of a regional approach to this. And just something I want to sort of throw out to Nick and Ian as well. If we've got 300 plus local authorities across two tiers, largely speaking, across the UK, do you find that a regional joined up approach, so a sub-regional, so parts of Cambridgeshire or a county level approach works better? Do you think that is better, and does that ease the burden on the likes of network providers like Ian or Nick in terms of funding advice, if there's a much more regional approach to it? What's your thoughts on that, given you mentioned the combined authority?
Well, I think it's good, because it's actually regionally is a good way to engage with our network provider and have a strategy that, have their strategy aligned with us. It's also, David very thoughtfully mentioned the market failure issues. And of course, we have a mixture of authorities of different sizes with different areas of focus. So there's a lot of learning from each other, which the combined authority can help to coordinate and facilitate, and supporting the smaller authorities. And of course, there's a fairness issue. So, in the Fens, they've got almost no charges at all. In Cambridge and around Cambridge, we've got some pretty high densities of charges. Well, actually, there's a real kind of market failure in the Fens, where probably the commercial providers are not going to be so enthusiastic to come in. And yet we need to make sure those communities are also enabled to be part of this transition. And I think that's a key area for the local authorities, actually for the combined authority, to see how can it help those local authorities with different circumstances and different needs.
Yeah, that's a real interesting point, and we'll perhaps develop that conversation in a minute about the sort of inequality, if you like. I mean, in one sense, you could see that it's obvious why cities are ahead of the rural communities, but what do we need to do to balance that up? So I'll come to you on that point perhaps in a moment, Ian. But just before, Nick, a few thoughts from you. You're working with local authorities again on the funding side of things. You're interacting probably with people who've got really broad portfolios as well, not just looking at EV and infrastructure or rollout of this sort of infrastructure. Just sort of some comments from you about the level of support from government, whether you feel that local government itself is supported in itself as enough to actually deliver this task ahead of us.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I mean, there's some really interesting points that were raised there around the kind of equity of service and the sort of levels of support that districts and regional bodies can offer in this deployment. I think what we've realised at the start is when we've been delivering the support to local authorities, that it is a real mixed bag across the country, and some councils have dedicated teams, some don't. Responsibilities of different parts of deployment of charge points spread across district and regional councils and unitary councils, so that doesn't help. So to answer the first point around would it be better to have a kind of combined authority approach to this, I think absolutely, because from an efficiency of service it just makes sense that there's a head of deployment and a portfolio holder that kind of drives within their region the sort of rollout of charge points. In terms of equity of service, I think that's where local authorities have a real quandary at the moment, because like we say, the commercial charge point operators are obviously very keen to deploy charge points where it makes economic sense, but then councils don't have a responsibility to all their residents to provide this absolutely essential infrastructure for them all. So I think there is some probably lessons learned, and we certainly run several webinars where we look at kind of procurement sort of practices where local authorities can kind of maybe encourage charge point operators to sort of spread their charge point operations around. But again, that's something that comes with a little bit of intelligent procurement that at the moment probably is lacking across a lot of this local authority service. In terms of government support, yes, there are lots of schemes out there with lots of funding available. I think we're in the early, again, from an intelligence point of view, we ourselves, Energy Savings Trust, administer the on-street residential charge point scheme that I think David's probably alluding to, that they've applied for in their charge points. We have fed back directly to government some of the feedback we've been getting from local authorities around potentially the short timescales and the caps on certain funding streams that actually, if they don't make sense from a point of view of why are we having these caps, why is there a time limit, then shall we change them? And I'm glad to say that there has been some changes to the on-street residential charge point scheme as a direct response to the feedback that we've received from local authorities. Can we do more? Always. We're in a decade of action. You know, I think I've heard it bandied around several times that this decade could be the most important decade in human history from a decarbonisation point of view, and charge point rollout is one of those. So absolutely, I think that at the moment in this decade, there can't be too much resource thrown at this.
And just to quantify that, you know, your comments there, Nick, you know, not losing sight of the fact that of all the greenhouse gas emissions, 20% of it comes from road transport. You know, so it's huge, and like you say, it's fascinating to look at it that way, isn't it? And we hear, you know, we watch things on the TV, we listen on the news, the amount of pressure on to make a difference in the next decade. You know, this whole rhetoric around it's not too late, we can still turn it around, but this is absolutely key to doing that. It's a real big slice of the pie when it comes to reducing greenhouse gas and everything else. So that's interesting. It's good to see actually as well that, you know, given some of the pressure and the comments you've been putting back to central government, I did notice that some of the time frames have extended. But again, you know, we need to keep this simple, don't we, as best we can. If it's overly complex, you've got officers, council officers that perhaps aren't dedicated to the rollout of this, and it was interesting you picked up on that. And you apply an overworked individual with a big portfolio to a complex system, it's going to be very hard to kick this into gear and ramp up the delivery. Ian, some comments from you around what we've heard, particularly around looking at regional and spatial plans and energy plans. And also, I'll come back to you, David, in a moment, just about what local authority, really fascinating, really, as we look at housing growth, to use that as a vehicle, if I can say that, to piggyback on the rollout of EV. So I'll come to you about that in a minute. But Ian, I'll come to you.
I think that authorities working together, a combined approach, is a much better way of doing this if it's possible from a resource perspective. There's been some fantastic work that's happened in West Yorkshire, where there's been a mass rollout of charging infrastructure on that basis. I think whether you work alone or combined, I think picking up on some of the points in terms of lessons learned here, my advice to anyone that's going to kick this work off is to almost batch up your more commercially viable opportunities with those that are absolutely not commercially viable. So for an example, authorities should be saying to the private market, look, you can have a contract to install your infrastructure in town centre car park A and on the side of the busy A road B. But if you do that, you're also going to do villages X, Y, and Z. And if you take that approach, that will still deliver a very competitive market that offers the opportunity to the authority to generate the revenues they need to deploy the infrastructure that's needed, and there will still be a competitive market for that. So that's the advice we always give to anyone that's kind of kicking off on this journey. I think that starts to address some of the issues of inequality that we've heard about here. Of course, if you say to any private body, which of these sites would you be willing to fund, we're going to pick the three best and start with those first and test it. So, but let's be really clear, the local authorities have a strong hand here, because if you ask anybody, which are the places you park your car, then there's predominantly going to be local authority bits of land. Now, yes, there's a massive role for the likes of the Sainsbury's of the world and the BPs of the world, and as we said earlier, the first thing you can do to cause the biggest impact is changing your planning laws. So if you're building a new car park, you will put in X charging bays, and even more importantly, you will future-proof for another X. But I think after that, balancing the portfolio of what you do is great. So almost then it's, once you've changed the planning law, I would then go and look at, right, what assets do we have? And then let the private market do the work for you. Let the private market talk to the DNO, as Baroness has talked about earlier there, and then let the private market tell you which sites are good or bad, because the CPOs like Osprey, like ourselves, we're doing this every day. We submit 50 applications to the grid every week. We assess 100 sites a day. So use the private market to do the analysis for you, given the resource constraints, and make sure you negotiate a fair basket of what's going to be delivered.
That's good. I like that basket sort of package approach, and I'll come to you in a moment, David. Just before I do on that, I've got just a few minutes remaining on this section. Just occurs to me as I'm listening, and we've talked about this regional approach now. And we know for a fact there are very few local authorities that you'll find a director of electric vehicle rollout infrastructure. Very, very few. They'll always be multitasking. But where I think there is an opportunity with a regional approach, whether it's a combined authority or just joined authorities working together in partnership, potentially to just co-fund the role. If you're talking about paying, and we know public sector finance, particularly local government, are tight, but if you're looking to pay somebody 70 grand to bring them on to do a role, that can be a lot of cash, a lot of pressure on the human resource budget. But actually, if you can split that across 6 local authorities and appoint someone on a regional basis, you've got an affordable, dedicated person who's looking at a regional approach to this, which seems to be, from what I'm hearing on in this conversation now, something that, Ian, you can work with. Welcome, Baroness Brown. You've made comments about the way it's working up in Cambridge and Peterborough, and Nick. So maybe I'm just throwing that out there for people who are on the call and listening, as to perhaps thinking about team working, if you like, cross-border working with other authorities, maybe co-funding these things.
Chris, if I could also add very quickly on it, but I think the other thing is that, don't be afraid to ask the private market for the money for that as well, because if you're going to spend, for example, £500,000 deploying charging infrastructure, then a contribution of £35,000 towards a headcount is a bit of a rounding error on the huge grid cost. To be honest with you, I think what we're seeing where deployment is not happening is where the local authority is kind of caught in two camps of, do we want to be a landlord and just let everyone get on with it, or do we want to be, and I'm going to use the word greed, which isn't fair here, or do we want to have a bigger piece of the pie? And it's when we see people saying, let's do this huge bit of work, and then what comes out is a 5-year contract, or what comes out is, we need absolute control over price and these things. A better approach for the local authority would be, actually, we're going to give you this contract, but you're going to make big contributions to help us resource the running of it, because you've got to think this is a big capex rollout. There's a lot of money going in the ground, and therefore that's a more effective way for the council to ask for support, if I may suggest that. No,
that's a really good suggestion, and I'm hoping that people on the call in local authorities are sort of scribbling that down, to know that the private market's willing to support in that way is a really good suggestion. David, just in the last moment or so, just coming back, what I'm also conscious, there's rollouts of huge amounts of growth across local government, across the country in all sorts of ways. And one of those is housing. And I was interested just on your comments around what you're doing in Swindon, and interested in Ian's comments about making sure that we force packages through. So, great, if the developer can do this, what else can they do under agreement in some of the more harder to reach locations? Just a final comment from you on that, and then we'll go on to the next section.
Yes, we know that the vast majority of EV users charge their car either at home or at work. So the planning authorities have a key role here in making sure that infrastructure is available at people's homes and in the town centres and the other places that they work that are publicly owned. So I agree with Ian's point completely. All planning authorities need to be making sure that new developments and new car parks have all the infrastructure put in up front by the company developing it. I mean, we saw this a bit with broadband, didn't we? A lot of developments about 10 or 15 years ago were going in with no broadband infrastructure. Well, we wouldn't consider now any application that comes forward without broadband being installed as part of the new development, and we need to take the same approach with EV infrastructure. Local authorities have got to get the planning side of it right.
And I think it's about local authorities being bold and to an extent demanding enough in terms of what comes forward. As you say, it's kind of bread and butter now to put broadband infrastructure in and fibre infrastructure in, but we need, as you say, to bring this sort of infrastructure to the same level of confidence that when we make demands, frankly, of developers, that we're really strong about that. Okay, David, thank you for that. That was a really useful section. We talked a bit about how local authorities might fund or have a position of somebody that can be responsible for this. I just want to really turn our thoughts for a moment just to if local authorities or a group of local authorities are fortunate enough to have that human resource in place, what sort of stuff would that individual be doing? How are they going to be spending their time? So I really want to look at for a moment how an officer like that would be spending their time trying to identify assets, where are the best places to go. And the other thing that seems to be coming across here, and it's not all about that, so I want to turn the tone a little bit here, is it sounds like it's probably me that's done it, but set a tone that it's a cost, it's a burden, there's a lot of effort that needs to go in, and there is elements of that. But actually, there are some really solid business cases here, and local authorities can use this rollout of the EV infrastructure to generate cash for themselves. So the business plan side of it as well. So probably, Nick, can I turn to you perhaps on that first, in terms of, we've got these people in place, for instance, or we're looking to get these people in place. How do they work? And then Ian, I'll come to you as well, because it's very much about delivery, isn't it, at that point?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Chris. So yeah, again, what we need is at the moment the highway as a piece of land is a very complex place with lots of vested interests above and below the ground, and so that first sort of job of someone that's got that responsibility is just to understand all the kind of vested interests in the section of highway that they're looking at. They need to engage with DNOs very early on to understand the sort of power requirements that potential location needs, and being able to kind of create a lasting a relationship with that DNO. And then within the council, they need to identify planning colleagues, highway colleagues, identify what contracts they already have existing on the highway, lighting contracts. Are they outsourced? Are they insourced? Even down to their highway maintenance teams. And first of all, just identifying all the key players in that complex land ownership issue before they sort of head off into planning what they want to do. Because until you have those conversations, you could be very far down the line and realize that there's a big kind of banana skin in the road, if you like, and all those things are scrapped. And I think local authority officers, of which I used to be one, so I do understand the pressures they're under, get disheartened, get kind of waylaid by other options, and these sort of plans become diluted. So I think Energy Saving Trust, one of the things we offer is being able to sense check local authorities' ambitions at a very early stage to understand whether the ambition they've currently got is ambitious enough, but also identify any gaps that they have within that kind of initial team network. And we certainly can't handhold all the way through the process, but what we can do is offer that confidence to local authority officers to then go and engage with the likes of Ian and his company, so that they don't feel like they're being hoodwinked and that they haven't got the full package of information before they start on their EV rollout journey.
Thanks for that, Nick. Ian, again, you're working very closely with officers in local authorities. Thoughts from you around the sort of things that officers need to be looking at and mindful of? And Nick's given us a really good introduction to that, but perhaps more from a delivery side.
Yeah, I'd agree with Nick completely. I mean, I think it is so complicated because there's so much infrastructure in the ground, as it were. There's so many different legal layers of ownership of the ground. So what we are seeing is where this is most effective is when the leadership and the desire absolutely comes from the top. Because I think even if we do one car park, we're getting into the parking revenue team, we're getting into the legal team, we're getting into the utility side of it. So I think there needs to be one instruction from the top that this needs to happen, and to coordinate and pull that together. I think where we have been installing in more built-up areas, we've seen huge issues trying to match the different worlds of, as I said, parking revenue, the TROs and things that need to go through, the highways works teams. So these are all on their own, they're all very simple tasks that we'd expect as part of a project, but in local authority world, they do take longer because of the resource shortage as well. So I think having a kind of coordinated and senior instruction and mission and vision to make this happen is so much easier, because it then feels as if you're dealing with one counterparty in the local authority rather than 16 different bodies. And again, we're delivering 5-10 projects every week, so we know everything that can go wrong. We just don't know how to unpick the different bits, and that's where it can be problematic. And solving the grid part will always take 3 to 6 months. We should be the bits in our control. We should be smashing that in 3 months and not losing a year on that part.
David, I'll come to you in a moment with your council leader's hat on, obviously, because you're leading a local authority that's in the midst of delivering this stuff, and you touched on some of the things you're doing. But we were going to put questions into a section, which I still will do. But I'll throw this question in that's come in from the panel, because it kind of links to this, and it's a good question, because it just sort of is a bit of a sense check question. But from what I've just heard from Nick and Ian, I think I know the answer to it. But the question is, does the panel really think the fueling of motor vehicles, fueling in the sense of electricity as a fuel, is a local authority responsibility? Is it not up to the motor manufacturers to ensure the network? What I've just heard then is, without the local authorities being instrumental in this, motor manufacturers can only come to local authorities to actually deliver the network if it was their responsibility anyway. Has anyone got a comment on that particular question that's come in? Yeah, Baroness Brown, please. Yeah.
Just a comment really in terms of the business models for some of these things. When you look at the costs of and the investments needed to reach net zero, the part of the equation that really makes sense actually in terms of payback is the decarbonisation of transport. By about the 2030s, the amount of capital that needs to go into decarbonising transport, so the new vehicles, the infrastructure, is already being balanced by the operational savings that people are seeing. And by the time you get out to 2050, the operational savings, are 2 or 3 times the capital cost. So this is an area where there is an enormous opportunity for some innovative business models that, much more so actually than decarbonising any other part of our economy. So there's, we need some ingenuity and some clever thinking here. And of course, it could well involve the car manufacturers or the car leasing firms, and the fuel suppliers or the charging infrastructure suppliers and the electricity companies. But there's real opportunity here.
No, that's good. I want to develop that actually just as we go on sort of towards the back end of this webinar. So hold that thought. I think I would like to throw that around, because I think you're absolutely right. There's a lot of opportunity in this change of direction as well. So David, just to come to you again, maybe just your thoughts as a council leader, again, very close to this. And you've obviously got officers in your organisation that are working very hard on the things that you're doing in Swindon. So maybe just some thoughts from you around the utilisation of assets on street, off street, etc., the amount of work that's involved. And I really want to really ask it in the context of that question as well, because I don't see how local authorities can't be at the forefront of this, to be frank, given everything that needs to happen.
Yeah, I think the answer to the question is both yes and no, actually, in that, yes, clearly if motor manufacturers are making solely electric vehicles, it's in their interest to ensure that all of their customers are confident enough to be able to go and buy one and know that they're not going to be left stranded anywhere. So the infrastructure's got to be in place. But we have talked earlier on about areas where the commercial sector will be less keen to put infrastructure in, and local authorities have a role in that space. Because most councils now have declared climate emergencies or targets in terms of getting to net zero. So actually, if local authorities are going to make good on that commitment, they need to be involved in this piece of work and ensuring that transport, as we're talking about today, gets as close to net zero as possible, as quickly as possible. So as I said, yes or no, yes and no. In terms of local authority involvement, it's a case of risk against reward, isn't it? At the moment, local authorities are pretty short of revenue, and therefore there's a temptation to get involved in something such as EV charging and look at it as a really good revenue stream for the local authority. But of course, local authorities don't necessarily, as we talked about earlier on, have the expertise, whereas people like Ian and in his area of work have a great deal of expertise because they're doing it day in, day out, and they know how to monetize the infrastructure and making sure it's profitable. So local authorities, I think, when they're drawing out their business plans, have got to be really careful about how much revenue they want to generate from this, how much risk they're prepared to take, or are they prepared to let the private sector do most of it, take most of the rewards, and just act as a facilitator? And that's the judgment I think each local authority's got to make.
Thanks, David. Okay, so some really interesting comments there. In fact, it's probably worth saying, probably one of the omissions, if you like, from this panel is somebody from the motor industry. But I think, in fairness to them, it's fair to say if you look at some of the big motor manufacturers like Ford, like Volkswagen Group, a lot of them have also started to do arm's length companies or associated companies that are involved in the rollout of electric vehicle infrastructure. So they are doing that, and they've set up companies in their own right. A lot of them are conglomerates of multiple manufacturers. So, you know, we talk about local authorities working together. They are actually working together to put some of these organisations, companies into place. You know, Ian, you're doing it off your own back as Osprey, but I think any comments from you in terms of some of the other organisations that have emerged over recent years that are probably led by the motor manufacturer side of it?
I think yeah, you're right. The motor manufacturers are definitely involved behind a lot of the big networks you're seeing rolling out, and all of us we're under huge pressure and also very good government direction to make sure that everyone's interoperable together. So there's a number of networks which the OEMs are helping with deployment of sites to get there. I think it's mainly, again, to roll these sites out, you need land. So it's the major landlords, it's the retail supermarkets, it's the the petrol forecourt companies that are doing it. But in recent weeks, there was a deal last week between Volkswagen Group and BP to get more and more chargers out there. So I think that I spent 9 hours yesterday in a government consultation, and last week probably 3 days in one. So there is so much work going on now to get this deployment out there. So I don't think this isn't about the UK is looking to the local authorities to solve it. I think the point is that for the residents, the local authority has an opportunity to help progress it even further. But I think the work is, at the moment, if you look at what's been deployed so far this year, the deployment is happening without the local authorities, because the local authorities, it's a bit of a harder nut to crack. Just one final comment, if I may, on David's last point. I think there is a happy medium. I'm taking my work hat off here. There is a happy medium between being the landlord and letting the private business take the opportunity, or taking the risk yourself. And that risk part is around will the site be successful or not? Is the money well spent or not? I think the local authority can, demand a lot up front from these installations, but also all the deals we do is we share a proportion of the profits with the local authority. So if things really do take off and go gangbusters, the local authority wins, but then the local authority doesn't take any risk in terms of the expenditure. So there's depending on each council's, the geographical makeup and the nature of their sophistication commercially, there's a happy medium to be found there.
Okay, so that's good. That leads us nicely onto the sort of final section before I just go to a few questions and wrapping up comments. We've got sort of 15 minutes or so to go. Baroness Brown has opened the door to the opportunity side of it, and Ian, you talked about the risk side of it, and of course both of those apply in any rollout of infrastructure at this scale. So I just really want to explore that a little bit. Ian, I'm just going to keep you talking for a couple of minutes because I want to just run this by people, because I'm not sure, there's a lot of people on the call and there'll be varying degrees of knowledge. But one thing we do know, if we talk about the motor industry again, the rate of the technology that's moving on, particularly battery technology, what we don't want, and here's a risk that we just need to flush out and talk, is local authorities, anybody really, private companies investing in charging infrastructure now that is obsolete 2 or 3 years down the line. And if you've just spent, a six-figure sum putting that in. So how do we protect against that? Is that in hand? Is it future-proof what we're putting in? How do we modularize it? Just some comments from you on that,
okay.
Ian, please.
So if you look at, as an example, so we're just putting 12 50 kilowatt rapid chargers into Cardiff city centre. That hardware, that will be obsolete in 5 years. There is no doubt. There's no way around it. But what's not obsolete is all the work to bring the power to the location where people go or where people sleep or where people work. And once the cabling is in, and once the legal agreement is there to create that charging site, it almost doesn't matter what the charging device is. And theoretically, if we end up doing hologram charging, contactless charging, whatever it is, the point is you've got the power, you've got the people, and the demand is there. That's what we have to deliver today. In many cases, what most of us and our peers will do is we're future-proofing these sites. So the electric vehicle batteries are getting bigger. They're going they're driving further, but you won't change how long you spend in that town centre car park. If you go shopping for 45 minutes, you're still going to go for 45 minutes in 5 years' time. The car might take more power then, but it's really about the site, getting the power there, get the lead agreement there, and have the right charging infrastructure for that location, be it the side of the A34 or the town car park.
Okay, that's a really good point, and I'm glad we flushed that out. Rather than picking anyone, does anyone want to volunteer any further comments on this particular subject? Nick, if I can go to you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think it's just important as well just to highlight the kind of cultural change. And I know there was a question there about, isn't it the responsibility of the car manufacturers and the forecourts to provide charging infrastructure? Well, they're certainly part of the solution. But actually, from a cultural perspective, the benefits of EV charging is you don't need a forecourt on every corner of every street. You can drive home and you can plug in and you can go straight into your house and start your day. So you don't actually, the forecourts are there for kind of this rapid charging that you may need, and the kind of commercial charging for people that are on, driving commercial vehicles. But from a residential perspective and a private car perspective, actually having charge points and sort of having the efficiency of being able to just charge on your street or at your workplace or as you're driving to a friend's house has massive benefits. And also we need to remember that there is always going to be a capacity issue. Ultimately, electrical capacity will increase as we transition over to kind of full electric vehicles. But that doesn't mean that we can have a rapid charger outside everybody's house, because one, that'll be more expensive, but two, that energy still has to be generated, and it's going to be green energy, and that will be increasing. But if you come in from work and you're not going to be using your car for 12 hours, you don't need a rapid charger. You need a slower pace charger. And actually, there's technology that's coming along now that would also actually monetize your vehicle as an electrical charging storage facility. And actually, so there is an opportunity, instead of one company swallowing up all the profits, we have an opportunity now where actually communities can actually share in the benefit of electric vehicles, electrical vehicle storage, and actually have a bit more of a fair distribution of that profit.
Yeah, that's really fascinating thoughts and insight, and knowing what's coming down the line as well, Nick. And let's not lose sight of, not everybody has a petrol forecourt at home. The beauty of EV, electric vehicles, is actually you can have your petrol forecourt at home. It's called a charging point, and that technology is moving on as well. And if you're trickle charging that overnight, again, as vehicle technology moves on, if that range is extending on a full charge, then you probably, you could be commuting best part of the week. The average, I can't think what the figure is, but the average amount of miles driven every day to commute is quite low, actually. It's sort of 20, 30, maybe a round trip of 40. Nick, do you seem to maybe know the answer to that one?
Yeah, it's around about 40 miles. But I was going to actually say, and this is the point going full circle about equity of service. And it's a good point you made, Chris. You don't need a forecourt on the corner of your street. And in rural locations, that's even more poignant, because if you're living in a remote rural location, you may have to drive a fair distance to actually get to your petrol station that you need at the moment. Whereas, if you install a charge point, and as long as that kind of infrastructure is there under the ground, like Ian says, then you're kind of freed up from having to kind of be go into that particular charge point. So, from a rural perspective, although at the moment charge point deployment seems to be more in an urban area, actually rural locations do require charge points, and actually in most cases are more dependent on their private vehicles than public transport, for instance.
Thanks, Ian. Sorry, Nick, rather. I'm conscious of time. We're into the last 10 minutes. Baroness Brown or David, do you want to add any further comments to this particular? You talked about the opportunity element a moment ago, Baroness Brown, and I like some of what Nick said there. Any further comments from you on this? Okay, good. David? Happy? Good. No, I think that was a really useful contribution there from Ian and Nick. I really like some of we got into a bit of brass tacks there, which is really good. I like that. So, look, as I say, we're into the last 10 minutes, and I've got some questions. I want to just make some time for closing comments as well. Ian, as you were talking, Greg Campbell asked the question saying, and I think it's probably a pithy question and a pithy answer, but is Ian saying that location is key for the chargers?
Yeah, having the right chargers in the right place. We talked about the residential charging where cars might sit for 12 hours is key. You look at a train station, cars probably sit there for 12 hours, town centre car park an hour. That means there's slow charging, rapid charging, ultra rapid charging on the side of your A roads. So yeah, it's about getting, this is not all about putting chargers into lampposts. It's not all about high power charging. Across every borough, there will be a different complexion of the charging.
Okay, so I'm going to turn to another question, which is good actually, because one of the groups we've not spoken about, we talked about manufacturers, we talked about local authorities, we talked about government, we talked about charging providers. But let's not forget the reason we're having this conversation is all about the general public out there that are driving around in these electric vehicles and will be doing more so in the years ahead, in the very short term and then longer to medium term. So I've got a question from Caroline Waterworth that says, how does the panel envisage the car user perspective being taken into consideration? And the follow-up to that is, should local authorities be engaging with the end user, or should this be factored in at a central government level? So how do we map that? This is all driven by demand of the end user at the end of the day. Has anyone got any comments on how we engage with the end user, if I can put it that way? Nick, thank you.
Yeah, well, we would always encourage local authorities to engage with the end user, and local authorities are increasingly being held to account by the end user in many parts of their service. So absolutely, if your EV rollout is in its infancy, demand-driven rollout is probably one of the best things you can do to start with. So if you're engaging with your local residents and finding out who's keen on charge points, who has an electric vehicle, who is thinking about having an electric vehicle, that's a great start point for any EV charge point strategy, because it will be able to give you some pins in the map to roll out some successful charge points, which is key, because again, residents are obviously always very acutely aware of things that they see as a bit of a white elephant and not being used. So it's really important that your initial EV charge points are used and utilised, and then that gives you a great place to start a matrix of charge points. And in a strategy, you could say, I want to provide a charge point every 500 metres. I want to depend in an urban centre, or in a more semi-urban, you could then start to see a slightly wider distribution. But demand-driven at the start is always a good way.
Nick, is that data out there, or would you say that local authorities, and I'll come to you in a second, David, would you say that local authorities need to start that at the ground up, or is that data kind of out there, knowing where the demands are located in particular places?
There are certain websites where residents can ask their local authority for a charge point, and some local authorities do run, an online form where they ask for residents to suggest locations based on certain things like that. And again, of course, if you've got a population that potentially is like private hire vehicles and taxi drivers, you'd want to know where they live, and if they're going to. They contribute probably a lot to a local area's emissions. So if a taxi driver or a private hire vehicle is thinking about changing to a zero emission vehicle, you'd really want to try and provide that infrastructure for them so they could do that.
Thank you, David. You indicated you'd like to comment here.
Yeah, I mean, community engagement, of course, is what councils do every day on a whole range of issues. And I think we've got to give some thought to how this transition is going to take place over the next 10 to 15 years, because people are going to be using internal combustion engine cars for at least the next 10 or 15 years. And one of the things we found where we're trying to install these 20 units in residential areas is there's been a little bit of pushback from people who still have petrol or diesel cars saying, well, why you take up all these spaces for electric charging points when we're driving other types of vehicles? You're going to reduce our opportunity for parking. And I accept that that's an issue and something that we have to overcome, and the answer in each local authority area or each area will probably be different. But we've got to be mindful of that, and we've also got to think about how people are, how are people in more deprived areas going to be more reliant on the internal combustion engine cars for longer and not have the resources to be able to make the change to electric vehicles. So in some of the poor areas, they might find that they're being left behind. So talking to communities and finding out what they want and what they can afford, I think, is crucial.
Okay, good. So I've got one more question, and I'm just going to go into some closing comments because we're into the last few minutes, and we've covered a hell of a lot of ground in the last hour or so. So, which I knew we would, and it's a huge project. And maybe we need to revisit this at some point, I'm sure. But in terms of the opportunities, Baroness Brown, if you might want to comment on this, but somebody's put through in the question, one of the great opportunities about this is we're talking about rollout of new technology, new infrastructure. So there's great opportunities for young people to get involved in this. We've talked briefly about job creation of maybe officer roles, but there's a whole industry behind this. And to me, that's you talked about that, a few moments ago, the opportunity that links with this change of direction. Any comments from you on that, particularly around job creation, young people, etc., skills and employment?
I think, as with so many of the issues around the green transition, the skills we're not yet, I think, on top of the kind of training and the kind of skills that we're going to need for the electric vehicle fleet, for the charge points. We know from online comments that one of the main gripes of people with electric cars is turning up at charge points that don't work. The maintenance, particularly of some of the early ones that were put in where local authorities were given money by government to put them in, but they weren't given any money to actually run them and make sure they continued to be in good condition and operating. So there are a whole range of skills, and about assessing homes and installing heat pumps and doing insulation. All of these new skills we need needs much more focus, and I think that's another area where local authorities with thinking of new colleges and things and supporting their existing colleges to make sure that people are really focusing on training courses for these new skills.
Oh, fascinating. You're right. This whole green transition, there's a huge opportunity for young people in particular to upskill and move it into this sector. So it's fascinating. Look, we've got 2 minutes left, so I'm just going to see if we've got enough time just to quickly go around. Maybe if I can stay with you, Baroness Brown. Probably the quickest way of doing this is, having think about what we've discussed in the last hour or so. What would be the top thing, if you could put it into a sentence, that you think that we need to do to drive this agenda forward? And as I said at the beginning, hit accelerate on the EV rollout.
Well, I would just want to remind people that, as you said, emissions from surface transport are something like 20% of our emissions. They haven't been falling. 70% of that is cars and vans, so is light duty vehicles. We know what the solution is. We really just have to get on with this if we're going to meet our target. And it is a fantastic demonstration of energy efficiency, as Nick will know, because by 2050, we will have replaced 500 terawatt hours of oil use that we use today with 125 terawatt hours of electricity and hydrogen. So these vehicles are so much more efficient, which is one of the reasons why they are going to do less damage to the environment.
Great. Probably we'll run out of time, but Nick, maybe just a top tip from you. What's resonating?
Yeah, absolutely. Sort of echo Baroness's comments there. Really, we just have to. You do have to dip your toe in the water for every local authority, even if it's a bit scary. I encourage people to visit Energy Saving Trust website, see what support's out there. We're not the only people that offer support. There are other supports that offers there. And become aware of what's on offer, I think, is the key. So, knowledge is power. So as soon as you understand what's available, you can start within your own local authority to understand the resource requirements that it's going to take for rollout.
Thanks, Nick. Ian, perhaps in a sentence, and then David, because we're literally in the last minute.
Yeah, just as Nick said, dip your toe, even if it's just one car park. Do a pilot this year, change the planning laws this year, and the private market will do so much more for you than you think they can.
Good. And David, you get the closing comment.
Thank you, Chris. Well, I'd point people towards the LGA's work on this area. An awful lot of work's been done by my board and the officers working at the LGA. There's a lot of really good information out there, but as others have said, local authorities need to be involved with this and engaging with private sector and government to make it happen.
Thanks, David. So it just leaves it to me to say really good hour spent. Hopefully people have got a lot out of it. I'd like to thank the people who joined us on the call, but of course I'd like to thank you all as panelists for joining us this morning to discuss this, and I'm sure Creators Communications will come back with a follow-up to this, because there's a lot more to talk about. It's exciting times, and I think we've had a really good discussion. So my thanks to all of you as panelists, and thank you. Thanks everybody. Have a good day. Take care.
Cool.